Hello and welcome to Not My Kids professional development series with Partnership to End Addiction. We are going to get started in just a moment. We're going to let a few more participants join. I hope you all are having a wonderful morning. All right. Awesome. So we can go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us. A quick introduction to who we are. My name is Sarah Grotto, and I am the Chief Programs Officer at Not My Kid. Not My Kid is a nonprofit organization where we do prevention and behavioral health services for youth and families. And we have partnered with Partnership to End Addiction to offer this professional development series for teachers, preventionists, honestly, anybody who works with youth can benefit from this information. Today's webinar is titled for an earlier and broader approach to building youth resilience. And so resilience is something that we are highly focused on at Not My Kid. So we are excited to have a partnership here. I can do a quick intro of our facilitators today. We have Partnership to End Addiction, which is a national organization in New York City. Its mission is to transform how our nation addresses addiction by empowering families, advancing effective care, shaping public policy, and changing culture. We have Dr. Linda Richter, the Senior Vice President of Prevention and Research and Analysis at Partnership to End Addiction, where she conducts research on the nature, scope, predictors, and consequences of all forms of substance use and addiction, especially amongst young people. Corey Hammond joins the team as the Director of Prevention Services. Partnership's prevention team leverages research to help raise awareness among parents, educators, health professionals, and policymakers about best practices in substance use, prevention, and addiction care. So thank you, Corey and Dr. Richter, for being here. We really appreciate it, and I will pass it on to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks again for joining us. This is the second installment of our professional development series. If you joined us for our webinar last month, we talked about the key principles of prevention science as a whole, and we talked about EBPs and what works in prevention and what doesn't. And so today's webinar is going to focus in on youth resilience, which, as Sarah said, is something that we're all, really interested in because we know it's such an important factor when it comes to prevention of all risk behavior, but especially substance use. And so let's get into it. And, obviously we would wish to be there in person with you all and have this be more interactive. And I know we're in a webinar setting, so Linda and I can't see you, but please, if you have questions or things that you want to bring up as we're going through this, you can use the chat or the Q&A function, and Sarah's going to help us monitor that, and definitely feel free to chime in as needed. If you haven't been with us before, welcome. Here's our team, the prevention team at Partnership. It's myself and Linda and our great research assistant, Olivia. And so here is what we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about what youth resilience means and how how we can build that. We'll talk about risk and protective factors in early life. And when we talk about building resilience, we talk about it with these 4 pillars. And so we'll go through each of them in detail. We talk about mental health, physical health, parent-child bonding, and then school and community connection. So those are kind of the 4 legs of our resilience table. And we will talk about some brief recommendations for how we can support this earlier and broader approach. We'll go through some practical skills. Partnership has a whole guide on how to build resilient kids, and so we'll go through some of those skills. And then at the very end, we will briefly go through some of the resources that Partnership has at our disposal that could be of use to you. And hopefully have some time for questions at the end. But as we're going through all of this, please utilize the chat function. If you were with us last month, you've seen this diagram before. This is our kind of tenet of prevention here. This is our whole philosophy. We talk about being early, soon, and proactive when it comes to prevention. So again, not just treating symptoms and consequences when they arise, but creating healthy environments that are necessary to prevent risky behavior in the first place. And so we know that one of the most important kind of upstream prevention tactics is building resilience in kids. So that's what we're really going to get into. So what does it mean to build youth resilience? I'm sure that we all kind of have an idea of what resilience means and what resilience looks like, but how do we really kind of build that in a young person? So again, this is kind of a recap, but resilience is this crucial ability to withstand, overcome, and rebound from a challenging situation or experience. And, as preventionists and people who work in public health and behavioral health, it is the responsibility of everybody who interacts with kids to help provide consistent, stable, nurturing, supportive environments that promote mental and physical health, provide a protective shield against adversity, and foster strength, growth, future orientation, and well-being. So we feel that it's the responsibility of everybody who interacts with kids to have a good foundation in this concept and know what they can do. So what are some of the attributes that feed into resilience? On the individual spectrum, we talk about things like social and emotional skills, those SEL programs. We talk about positive temperament and feelings of self-efficacy. If we move kind of slightly external and talk about families, we think of warmth and cohesion, strong, clear expectations, and then parental involvement and monitoring. And then in the larger community, we talk about feeling connectedness to school, having a trusted adult mentor, and having strong social networks. So all of these things are very important when it comes to someone's resilience. And so we want to kind of bolster all of these things as much as we possibly can. But it's also interesting that some attributes, we don't want as much of them as possible. So it's obvious that some things like effort in academics, SEL skills, neighborhood safety, like the more of those factors we can get, the better. That's a perfect linear relationship, that the more of that attribute you have, the more resilience you're going to have. There's other attributes that work kind of differently, where they're more of like if we were to look at it on a graph, it's kind of a bell curve shape, where it's most protective at kind of this middle point, as opposed to on the low end or the high end of the spectrum. And some of these are kind of counterintuitive. So it would be things like extreme wealth, like having too much wealth is bad, but obviously having too little wealth is bad. So kind of the midpoint of that is most protective. Parental monitoring is the same way. Obviously, you don't want kids to be neglected and not monitored at all, but then not allowing kids to have privacy and like a helicopter parenting, kind of the most monitoring possible is also not leading to good outcomes. So that's another one that's kind of the midpoint. And so I just think that's kind of a fun point. And when we think about these different attributes, we want to think about how they impact a kid and what level of it would be most effective. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Linda to talk about risk and protective factors.
Great. Thank you, Corey. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So you've all heard about risk and protective factors, things that increase the risk for the kind of outcomes we are trying to avoid for kids versus protective factors, which are those things in a child's life that kind of give them sort of a buffer against the risk and put them on a better trajectory to better outcomes. And in many cases, resilience is one of those protective factors, but it's, as we'll see soon, it's not necessarily something a child is either born with or not, although there's certainly, some individual differences in the extent to which it comes naturally to a person, but there are many things that the adults in a young person's life and the systems around them can do to build that resilience. So it's not a fixed feature or trait. It's something that can be changed and extended and enhanced. So when we talk about risk and protective factors, though, there are certain risk factors that are really prominent that we know increase the likelihood that a young person will use substances. Again, when we, you all know this, when we say substances, we mean nicotine, alcohol, drugs, or misuse prescription drugs. But not just that it also increases the risk of other adverse outcomes or things we're trying to avoid for young people. And the common way of talking about these recently in the past, decade or two has been adverse childhood experiences. And those are ACEs. Which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. So technically, the definition of ACEs is a child or young person who has experienced one or more of these characteristics or experiences that's listed here on the slide. So abuse or neglect, having mental illness or addiction in the family, having an incarcerated relative, having a mother who was treated violently, so essentially domestic violence in the home, but mostly focused on the mother, and parental divorce or separation. And that last one is very broad. There's plenty of people who have had parental divorce or separation in their life, and they're perfectly fine. It's obviously all in how, the nuances of that. But nevertheless, the original research or studies that were examining the effect of these adverse childhood experiences on future outcomes for young people focused in on these particular variables. And what was really striking in this set of research findings was the more ACEs a young person had, or more of these characteristics, the significantly higher their risk for substance use and other adverse outcomes. And it was really a very linear relationship. Actually, every adverse childhood experience you added on contributed quite significantly to a higher risk of substance use, addiction, and other adverse outcomes. Over time, just to let you know, the word ACEs has been used a little bit more broadly than just what these particular characteristics are on this slide. And it's come to really mean childhood trauma, high rates of persistent stress, and a whole range of adverse experiences or negative experience for children. And just, I didn't say this, but as you saw, it was quite a significant number of people. I think it was 35 million have experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences as it's characterized there. So the reason it's so important is because, it's very intuitive that if a child has experienced a lot of trauma or negative things, they're going to be at higher risk. That's not like some great big, new thing that no one could have thought of. But what was really so striking about this research is that it really does show how insidious these early experiences can be and how long lasting they could be and how they actually affect not just how someone thinks about things, but also literally physiologically. It has, really prolonged effects on someone's physiological response to stress. And that physiological response really manifests in many ways that increase risk for mental health issues, substance use, and other negative outcomes. So what we do know is that when someone experiences one of these adverse experiences pretty early in their life, and the stress associated with it is prolonged and relentless. So again, it's not necessarily something that happens once, the incident is resolved, it's handled well and people move on. These are things where, there is this like ongoing pernicious like stressor in a young person's life. And it could produce a physiological toxic stress response that affects your hormones, affects brain chemistry, and it could lead to negative physical health consequences that interferes with a child's healthy brain development. And we also know that a lot of times these ACEs are intergenerational. So if one person has it, then then it could kind of get passed on to their children and onward. And so really the goal for us in prevention is to kind of break that intergenerational cycle of adversity and mental unwellness and addiction in the family by addressing these early risk factors. So one way to think about it, and this image on the right is a little hard to see, but essentially what we're trying to show is how a set of risk or protective factors that are evident in infancy or early childhood then sort of funnel into a whole related but different set of risk and protective factors in sort of early childhood and mid-childhood, which funnel into a set of risk and protective factors in adolescence. And many of these are sort of cyclical. So think, for example, of a child who doesn't develop a strong bond or attachment with a parent in infancy. And that likely could be because the parent has a mental illness, let's say, or has untreated addiction, or is living in poverty and has to work 3 jobs and doesn't have time to bond with a child. So there's something that's producing this lack of a parent-child bond early in a child's life, which produces, certain characteristics in the young person. And that then funnels into certain characteristics in early childhood, which then affects how people respond to that child, how that child acts in social situations, how confident the child is, how the child's self-esteem or self-regulation capabilities, which then, produces certain effects later on. So these behaviors sort of work on each other and produce this kind of cascading effect. And really the goal here is to break that cycle, that cascade, as early as possible by introducing as many protective factors and reducing the risk factors. So I just want to point out like a couple of very cool studies that really shows this in a way that we tend not to think about so much. So there's been some really interesting research recently on things like maternal stress and poverty in a child's life and how that has these kind of rolling implications going forward. So we know that early childhood brain development is quite intense, right? Like it's a very, major period of brain development between the years of 0 to 3, for example. And there's research showing how if there's a parent who has experienced maternal stress, they have been able to show direct effects on the neurodevelopment and sort of the social, emotional, and cognitive development of the child, which then they can show links to later impaired mental health for that child. So you take a mom who has experienced stress due to a whole variety of things, and you could see how that affects the child's brain development over time. Another example is there's been studies of children living in poverty or in kind of dysfunctional or unsafe neighborhoods where there's a lot of adversity, which they have linked to chronic stress in the parent and child. So kind of produces this sort of stress symptom in the parent-child relationship. And again, linking that to the child's brain development and then onward to the child's risk for substance use and mental health problems. So again, the point here is there's like these environmental social situations that are having a really important impact on the physical brain development of the child, which then translates into social, emotional, and mental health problems later on, higher risk for substance use and other negative outcomes. So that's all very sad and depressing, but one thing that this has led to, this kind of body of research, is looking at the opposite. So for example, there's this really fascinating study called Baby's First Years, and it's a longitudinal ongoing study. But essentially what they did in that first year was provide cash payments to some low-income families, and then they compared them to similar income families who did not receive these cash payments. And again, these were not like massive payments, but it was, something substantial. And then they traced the baby's brain development. They kind of did neuroimaging studies, and they really saw that just the only difference was whether the family received cash payment or not. They saw faster brain activity in the baby's first year of life, which is an indicator of more development or better development. And so here you have something like this, intervention, a protective intervention, which is just providing money to some families versus others. And you see a direct impact on the child's brain development. And again, it's a little hard to do this interactively now, but the conclusion that was drawn from that is essentially by providing these cash payments, you're reducing the stress in the family and the parents. They now have more time potentially to kind of focus on the parent-child bond, or there's just less stress in the home because they have, some extra cash on hand to take care of the things they need to. And that sort of provides a better environment for the developing child. And relatedly, there was a similar study where instead of cash, they gave free diapers to single moms, new moms who just had babies. And again, same thing, traced the development of the child and found that just by being offered and provided with free diapers, which is a big expense for new parents, it really had a significant impact on the parent-child bond and then the child's development. So there are these little interventions that could really affect the trajectory of a child's health and development. So what that tells us is contrary to what a lot of people know and do in the field of prevention, which is, starting too late, is that we really need to start early because there are all these foundational risk and protective factors that appear very, very early in a person's life. And what we want to do is minimize those risk factors before they get entrenched and start cascading through the young person's development. And we want to put in protective factors early on so that those cascade in a positive direction. And some of it is also substance use field, for example, is learning from other fields. Like there's a lot of research in child literacy and child poverty, where you can really learn a lot about what kind of factors reduce risk for kids versus improve outcomes. And we kind of don't want to be too siloed in our field by not looking to the research in those other areas, because there's really a lot of informative lessons there. And then the other goal of starting really early is to kind of relieve some of the burden we now have on those who are trying to address adolescent substance use risk or mental health risk, because we wait too long. And so all, sort of the focus ends up having to be on those adolescent years where kids are really struggling because we didn't do enough early on. And if we do more early on, we'll have fewer kids and adolescents who are struggling and be able to kind of allocate the resources to those kids who actually do need it at that time. So, Corey mentioned that we're going to talk about building resilience in different sort of categories of a child's life. And obviously mental health is one of the most important. So we do know that millions of children in the United States are now struggling with mental health problems, and that the problem is now more severe than it was before the pandemic. We know that about 1 in 2 adolescents ages 13 to 18 have a clinical mental health disorder or qualify for a clinical mental health disorder. And about 1 in 6 children ages 2 to 8 have one. That's a lot of kids. We also know that if it's left untreated, these mental or behavioral health problems do increase the risk of substance use in adolescence and into adulthood. So childhood mental health problems obviously typically require interventions from a trained healthcare professional, and the earlier the intervention is provided, the better. So while there's a limit to what parents and others can do to kind of prevent a mental health problem in a young person, there is a lot that they can do to kind of foster resilience so that those mental health issues do not then cascade into other problems in the child's life. So you're probably all very familiar with the concept of social and emotional learning. It is really an incredible advance in how we do education nowadays in terms of thinking about children's development and schooling, for example, not just in terms of them learning their ABCs, but also learning how to self-regulate and how to manage their emotions and express them in a healthy way, and how to build relationships, etc. So essentially, these are the core elements of building resilience, because these are things that help children thrive in the face of obstacles instead of sort of falling apart. And we know that there are ways that we can help build this resilience. And if we do, it's sort of, again, this cascading or self-perpetuating process, because if a child has resilience, then they act in a way that people respond more positively to, which kind of reinforces those behaviors. So if you do strengthen resilience, one way it happens is by eliciting these positive responses from others, which improves the child's confidence and leads them to healthier and more adaptive social interactions, and sort of just sticking with things a little bit more, and that therefore experiencing more successes, which again builds that resilience. So one thing that's really important to consider is this notion of emotional regulation. So that's basically the ability to recognize, control, and express emotions in a measured and an appropriate manner. So that's not to say, so it's not suppressing unpleasant feelings, but it's learning how to recognize them and name them and understand them as important clues to why someone is reacting to an experience in a certain way or another. So for example, a lot of times when a child is walks into a situation, or an adult for that matter, and feels anxiety, I'm not talking about clinical anxiety, but just like an anxious feeling, that's actually a very important indicator that there is something in the environment probably that is to be kind of vigilant about or concerned about. So your emotions are kind of teaching you something, and responding to them in an adaptive way is healthy. That's why we have those kind of emotions, why we get, nervous or fearful and anxiety-ridden situations. It kind of makes sense. So what we want to do is make sure that when a child is experiencing those sort of negative emotions, we don't want to sort of say, oh, why are you sad? Don't be sad, or don't be scared. Because these stress, anger, fear, these are necessary emotions, and they're normal. And they're, again, useful signals that something probably needs to change in one's behavior. But the key is whether or not the expression of those emotions are proportional to the situation. So obviously, if a child is having extreme anxiety or fear in a situation that doesn't really seem to call for that, then that's of concern. Or if a child is, more than just a little angry when something doesn't go their way, but kind of the anger persists and it gets broader and broader and it's not under control, then that's a sign of something that's not on the healthy spectrum. And what we could do is teach kids to kind of regulate those emotions and express them in a way that is respectful of the fact that they're experiencing them, but not trying to kind of wipe them away or, pretend that they don't exist. And likewise, if a child is, for example, experiencing joy from something that isn't really that healthy or good, parents or other adults can teach them that even though that experience feels good to them, it's not that healthy or safe for them in the long run. So for example, a kid who's riding a bike without a helmet on a nice day, like it kind of feels good. Your hair is blowing in the wind. It's like a nice feeling. It kind of makes you feel free. But in the end, it's not that good for you because you could fall and really hurt yourself, right? So likewise with, for example, substance use, obviously it feels good for people, but we want to be able to explain to kids and help them understand how just because you're feeling good about something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's something you want to repeat again and again. You want to understand why it makes you feel good, but there's also reasons to consider sort of the safety and health around it. So just like emotional regulation, coping skills can obviously be learned. And that's what a whole range of the sort of prevention programs that we give kids nowadays are really built around, teaching them coping skills, which is the ability to deal adaptively with a problem, and kind of making sure that we model for children that if something goes wrong, if there's some sort of mistake or imperfection, then that's okay. And you sort of cope with it and take on that challenge and bounce back. So a lot of resilience building is really modeling by adults for the children. Things like the importance of taking care of oneself, seeking help and support if something's not going well. These are things kids can see adults who are important to them do, and they can learn from that. And obviously, there's a whole range of coping skills we can help teach kids directly, like taking breaks from a stressful situation by playing or, exercising or relaxing, talking it through. So you identify what's the problem, and maybe a trusted adult can help think it through with them, coming up with specific strategies to address the problem. And obviously, if it's something beyond one's individual control, ultimately trying to get help from a qualified professional. But again, we always emphasize how important the modeling feature component of resilience building is. So when we talk about resilience as a skill that could be practiced and honed, it's not something that someone either has or doesn't have. And it's basically a dynamic process. It could change over time. And schools and community members, parents, they're all really responsible and instrumental in helping children build this resilience over time. And then there's physical health as well. So kids can really learn how to build resilience around their physical health, which is super important as well, and also relates to their mental health. So, for example, we really want to ensure that kids' physical health is in good, that they're healthy, right? But there are certain physical health conditions that are either genetic or unavoidable. And many kids who have them will face really significant burdens due to these, conditions. But there are many conditions that kids experience that are kind of preventable. That if it's not handled well, then it kind of does affect their ability to be resilient in the face of challenges. So what we want to do is try our best to kind of help children develop the habits that will protect their physical health and make them feel strong and have self-efficacy, but also addressing those threats to their physical health that they themselves can't control or that are kind of out of adults' control as well, as early as possible. So if there's a child with certain physical health impairments, there's ways to build their resilience around that so that, let's say, they're not experiencing bullying or low self-confidence and they become more resilient despite those health conditions. But as I was saying, there are many health conditions that we can also help children avoid through better diet, exercise, sleep, avoiding things that impair one's physical health, like substance use, etc. So two of the key ones are obviously nutrition and exercise, which are super important. And we know that they can disrupt physical health development, healthy physical development. We know that a significant proportion of children and adolescents are technically obese, which is a significant health problem and often starts in early childhood. But we also know on the opposite end of it, or it's not necessarily one or the other, but millions of kids are living in a home with food insecurity. So they don't have enough to eat or they don't have good quality, nutritious food to eat. We know that nutritious foods is so important for children's brain development, for their ability to focus and function well in school and academics, to interact socially in an adaptive way. So these are the things that typically in sort of substance use, mental health prevention circles, we don't address, but really things like good nutrition, good exercise, getting fresh air to the extent possible, given a person's neighborhood and circumstances, are actually very beneficial to mental health and a good protective factor against substance use and other risk behaviors. And then one of the most important ones that we really like to emphasize is sleep. So we know for adults, we don't get enough sleep. It's always falls by the wayside, but it happens for children too. And a lot of the risk factors and problems that we see in young people that interferes with their ability to be resilient and function well in school and in social situations and to avoid risk behaviors is inadequate sleep. Inadequate sleep directly interferes with brain development. It's especially harmful to adolescents. And it actually there's a lot of research showing direct links between inadequate sleep and higher risk of substance use and a whole range of mental health problems as well. So the more we could do as adults to ensure that kids are getting enough sleep, the better it'll be. The more we can ensure they don't use substances, obviously, for their physical health, getting them regular checkups with pediatricians, and just basically being conscious of their physical health overall so that they are not at a disadvantage among their peers and for their potential. I'll pass it back to you now, Corey.
Thanks, Linda. And so the third tenet of this is parent-child bonding and family functioning. So, if a child has really great mental health and really great physical health, if their family functioning is abysmal, then they're still going to be at a disadvantage. And so what can we do? So we know that stability, safety, security within a family is critical for someone's resilience. There's certain parenting skills that can mitigate kind of threats to healthy family functioning and benefit children regardless of outside risk level. And, you know, it's clear that there's a lot of obstacles to forming kind of strong, secure, stable, protective families that are outside of the control of parents potentially. But there are a lot of skills that parents can be taught and practice to kind of increase their family functioning, increase their parent-child bonds. So there are things that we can do, even though some of it is, you know, unavoidable. Some of the risk factors that we know interfere with family functioning, things like family conflict. And so certainly kind of intense, frequent outbursts, arguments, but also things like nonverbal anger is things that kids will pick up on, and can cause kind of lasting toxic stress in the home, which, as we know, kind of persistent toxic stress can lead to lasting health effects and negative consequences, a lack of quality time spent together. And when we say quality time, that it doesn't have to be a very formal, planned event or affair. It can really just be having a meal together, just being in the same room with each other, essentially. Having an adversarial approach to family dynamics. This is, you know, parents versus the children, as opposed to a more team-based approach, and not allowing for fun. So we know that laughing and playing together is a hugely important factor for strong family functioning as kids grow up. And we know that the stress on families at times doesn't allow the time and opportunities for fun in the home, which is certainly something that we want to try to address if possible. And when we're talking about family interactions, we love to talk about this health-based approach. And if you've been with us for any of our parent webinars, this is something that we stress a lot, the health-based approach. And that just means focusing on health and safety first and foremost, not punishing undesired or unhealthy behaviors, and not focusing just on kind of obedience for the sake of obedience when it comes to kids. A health-based approach is rooted in this idea that we recognize that kids have undesirable or unhealthy decisions, and those decisions happen for very rational, developmentally appropriate reasons. Next month, we'll go a lot into the nuances of adolescent brain development, and so we'll talk a lot about that. With the whole point being that when we understand the motivations behind behaviors, to help kids satisfy these needs that they have with healthy and safer alternatives. So we want to really emphasize having a health-based approach to family dynamics rather than a punitive kind of punishing approach to family interactions, which we know is hard, but it's something that we can practice. And our fourth and last tenet is school and community connection. And this one is really rooted in the idea that we know research has shown that youth who feel connected to their peers in their school are significantly less likely to experience substance use, mental health challenges, sexual risk behavior, violence, all of these things that we're trying to prevent. And so school connectedness is this belief that a student is being supported by the adults in their life, and that the adults at their school care about their education and their well-being. And so when we're talking about prevention programs and things that we're trying to do in schools, we really want to instill this sense of connectedness and make sure that that's in place so that the prevention that we do is as effective as possible. So again, children who feel connected are more likely to engage in healthy behaviors and succeed academically and socially. Strong connections equip children with invaluable life skills, can help them foster a sense of belonging and purpose, and improve academics. Risk factors that interfere with engagement, these I'm sure are fairly obvious, but social isolation and loneliness. Feeling isolated or lonely can make kids avoid school in general or avoid activities that they like, and which kind of perpetuates this cycle of loneliness and isolation. So this is missing out on important social opportunities, which certainly impedes mental and social development. Should be no surprise that an unsafe school or community environment will hinder someone's ability to feel connected to their environment. And so this could be high crime rates, high rates of substance use in the community. Kind of similar is being bullied. Significant impediment to a child's sense of safety or connectedness in their school. We know that kids who are victims of bullying tend to do worse in school and might avoid going to class or participating in extracurriculars. And we know that although any child can be a victim of bullying, there's, some are at higher risk than others. And then similarly, kind of racism and discrimination. These both can have short and long-term toxic effects on health, education, financial stability, relationships, self-confidence, it's all encompassing. And so these are kind of important factors that we want to take into consideration when we're trying to improve someone's connectedness to their community. And so our recommendations to support an earlier and broader approach around resilience. We have a whole host of these that we could include. We really narrowed it down to just what can people who work in prevention, kind of behavioral healthcare providers, what can they do? But we do, we have lists and lists of these things that include policy recommendations, recommendations for parents, recommendations for teachers, all kinds of things. But so what can healthcare providers, behavioral health professionals in schools and communities, what can they do to kind of lay this groundwork of building resilience? And one of those things is educating parents. We certainly try to do that with our parent webinars, but educating parents about protective and risk factors, how to address those protective and risk factors even before signs of risk emerge. We certainly talk about that in terms of substance use, but it really fits for any type of risk behavior. And then more on the healthcare side of things, we talk about screening young people for all forms of risk, including those ACEs that Linda talked about earlier, but also screening for kids for low school readiness and deficits in self-regulation as part of their routine clinical visits. And similarly, kind of healthcare related, providing counseling to parents whose children are diagnosed with some of these conditions that would increase their risk, like ADHD, any type of trauma or stress related disorders. And then providing parenting skills support to all parents, but certainly parents who are receiving substance use or mental health treatment, to really kind of put them on the path to success. And you've probably seen us talk about this before, but just really going back to this idea of the Swiss cheese model, that we're imagining all of these different layers of protection in a child's life, where, each specific factor, each specific thing has all of these holes in it, like a slice of Swiss cheese, where they're not perfect. But when we layer 5, 6, 7, 8 of them on top of one another, those holes all get covered up and we have a firm layer of protection. So that's really what we're always trying to do. So that's the point of this integrated approach, that we can layer all of this risk around a kid. And so when we're talking about teaching parents skills, we have a whole set of practical skills that we teach parents. They come from our Raising Resilient Kids guide, and so these are the 10 key protective parenting strategies, which many months ago, if you saw our Raising Resilient Kids talk, we focused on a lot of these, and we'll go through some of them again. But these are kind of how we frame resilience for parents, because we could talk about risk and protective factors as much as we want to with parents, but it's really helpful to teach them strategies and skills that they can implement right here, right now in their home. They're looking for guidance. And it's not coming from a place of we're trying to teach people how to raise their kids and tell them how to parent, but parents do come to us at Partnership for guidance and strategies that they can use in tough parenting moments. And so that's what our guide is that Linda was kind of integral in creating. And so as prevention specialists and people who work either in schools or in nonprofits, you may have parents come up to you and ask for guidance. Like, what can I do in this situation? Here's what's happening with my kid. What can I do? And these are general enough that they're kind of beneficial for anyone to learn, whether you're a parent yourself or you're a teacher or you're working in prevention. So we'll go through these kind of one by one and offer some practical tips along the way. So one of the things that we always say, no surprise, is starting early. It's never too early to promote healthy attitudes, emotions, and behaviors. And it's never too early to start noticing and responding to risk factors. And so if we're teaching parents this, a parent might say, okay, but what do you mean by responding to risk factors? Like, what does that mean for my kid? And so we would say to this parent that means kind of being aware of anything that could be bringing adversity into your child's life. Maybe they need some extra help building communication skills, or maybe they're prone to anxiety, kind of disproportional levels of anxiety. So meeting with a CBT therapist could be helpful. Just being proactive about what your kid might be up against so that we can kind of put them on the path to success. The second one is knowing the facts and being a credible source. We tell parents to keep learning from trusted sources and know how and when to say that you don't know something. With the age of social media, this gets harder and harder to know what a credible source is and what's not. But if a parent comes to you and they're like, here's this information that I found on TikTok, how do I know if this is a credible source? How do you respond to that? And so we would say, that this is certainly difficult at times, but just because someone has millions of followers on social media doesn't mean that they're a reliable source. And so we certainly tell parents to, get second opinion with a trusted medical provider, go to their pediatrician. And our practical tip when it comes to this that we teach parents is, trying to get our information from .gov, .edu, .org websites, almost always more credible than something from a .com website. So checking URLs. Being a good model for health and resilience. Linda touched on this one. If they're not always listening to you, children are certainly watching what you do as a parent or a teacher or a professional. So we want to normalize making mistakes, having imperfections, and bouncing back. We teach this to parents, and a lot of times parents will say, okay, but I can't be perfect all the time. What happens if I'm modeling bad behavior? We would respond to this and say that being imperfect is important to model. It's important to model what you do in response to your flaws or your slip-ups. It's important to model how to apologize and forgive, and being honest about our shortcomings and being honest about doing better next time. Communicating openly and honestly. Having open conversations to develop strong mutual trust in that parent-child bond that we were talking about. And when it comes to substance use, a lot of times we have parents ask us, what do I do if my child asks if I've ever tried drugs? Do I answer honestly? This is a tough one, but kind of everyone has a different opinion on this one. We talk a lot about how oversharing in this case is certainly a possibility. And we can get more into this next month when we talk about substance use specifically. But we want to avoid giving more information than asked for and really just focus on what they're dealing with at this time. So sharing what you've learned as you focus and look back on your previous experiences, but really focusing on what's important, that you don't want them to use drugs. And our practical tip for this one that we love to tell parents about is using a car ride as an opportunity to talk about substance use or risk behavior. The lack of eye contact can help a child or teen feel more at ease, and there is an inherent time limit to the conversation. Sharing expectations. This is another one that we love to talk about in terms of having a health approach to family dynamics, basing our expectations in love and concern, and not just because I said so. And so, parents might say, how do I know what's a reasonable boundary and what might be too strict? And this will look different for every family. And boundaries change as kids get older. And one thing that we love to tell parents is that if a kid feels that they've been a part of the decision when it comes to a specific rule, they'll feel more kind of inherently motivated to abide by that boundary. Monitoring behavior and well-being, spending quality time together, asking lots of questions, keeping an eye on screen time and social media presence. And certainly we know that social media has the ability to be both a risk and protective factor in terms of kids' resilience. And so a lot of parents have questions about what age they should let kids have social media accounts. This, again, a lot of people have differing opinions, but, legally kids need to be 13 for most social media apps. But we know that more than any specific age, you're looking for signs of maturity and responsibility, and having an agreed upon monitoring plan is very important. Our practical tip here is that you can encourage kids to use their parents' monitoring as an excuse to not post risky things or engage in risky behaviors. We tell parents to encourage kids to use them as a scapegoat or a blaming tool, where in any situation a kid can say, like, sorry, I can't do that. My mom would absolutely kill me. I would get in so much trouble if she saw that. Even if it's not true, we encourage parents to let kids do that, to get out of uncomfortable situations. Taking a health approach, again, we talk about this a lot, supporting health rather than punishing unsafe behaviors. And then, parents come back at us and say, okay, but what if they do something wrong? Do I not punish them? And this is one that we get a lot. It's, we say that it's unlikely that your kid is lashing out or behaving poorly just for the fun of it. There's usually a rational reason for fights or outbursts, and often a solution. But a health-based approach means that consequences and rules are explained and agreed upon in advance of being broken. And the focus is always on protecting safety and well-being, not just obedience for obedience sake. Healthy risk-taking and emotional expression, helping kids go beyond their comfort zone safely. What if a kid's not a thrill seeker? We certainly know that that's fine too. We tell parents to let them help be a part of a conversation and decide what the kid is interested in and help them pursue it. We just want kids to be stimulated and challenged so that they gain this confidence and resilience as they move through life, so that they can hopefully avoid risk behaviors. Positive reinforcement, positive feedback. Some parents might say, what if my kid's not doing anything worth praising? And certainly a real question we've had from parents that might definitely be how they feel sometimes, but behaviors that get praised or positively reinforced are going to continue. So even just normal daily tasks, getting up on their own, making it to school, putting effort into homework, these are all things that can be reinforced. And we like to tell parents to focus on the effort, not the outcome. I appreciate how much effort you put into studying for that test is a lot more positive and effective feedback than great job getting an A. We really want to focus on the work that went into it, because they're not always going to have a perfect outcome, but we can still praise the effort that went into it. And then finally, knowing a kid's risk level and responding accordingly. And so this is something that we as preventionists can teach parents how to do. So to teach them to be vigilant, respond to risk, but know when it's out of their realm and know when to seek help. And so one of the kind of training exercises we do here is parents might say, I found out my teen is smoking weed. How do I convey the seriousness of this without overreacting? And so we talk about how to kind of mitigate risk and responding accordingly. You know, a kid who tried marijuana might not need inpatient rehab, but in a different situation for a kid that's struggling with a depressive episode and is drinking a lot, we might need to kind of escalate our response. And so we have a whole host of resources that can help in a situation like this. And so just, I know I only have a minute left. We have our Resilient Kids section of our website. We have the guide to raising resilient kids that if you're someone who works with parents and kids, you can download from our website and use as a resource. We have playbooks for parents of teens and tweens. You can, if parents are coming to you and asking for information, you can send them to the website to look at these. These are also available in Spanish. We have skill building courses for parents. They can visit our website and do these kind of at their own pace. And here is our contact information. Sorry, I kind of was speeding up there at the end. I didn't want to go over, but thanks so much for your time. And if you have any questions about this, definitely put something in the Q&A or the chat and we can get to it. But otherwise, you can always email Linda or myself and we can either point you to resources or help you find what you need.
Thank you, Corey. Such good information. And I did put in the chat the Parents Guide to Raising Resilient Kids, in case anybody wants to grab it there. And then, like you said, it is available for download on your website. Lots of good resources. Those playbooks are amazing too. So I know that's a resource that we do give out a lot. And so I haven't seen any questions come through the chat, but I appreciate you also sharing your contact information. So if anybody does have questions, whether they're here watching this webinar live or if they're watching the recording, they can email you all, but then also Not My Kid. You are open to emailing us, calling us, going on social media, following us, sending us your questions any which way. We are happy and a really great local resource for providers and professionals as well. So I want to give Linda, if you want to, any final remarks before we close it out?
No, really appreciate you having us. And again, all the stuff on our website is free and available. And there's a lot there for not just for parents, but for professionals who work with children and parents as well. So, you know, I think we have a lot of consistency with the Not My Kid philosophy and mission. And, you know, if there's anything there that will be helpful to you, please take it and use it.
Thank you. So we will see everybody back next month for the next webinar, which we will continue this conversation and continue building on all of these things that we're talking about. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.